Today's topic is actually one that sometimes I think gets undervalued a little bit in the OpenPOWER Foundation, right? I mean, we hear comments about, oh, we need more documentation, we need more documentation. And one of the initiatives as new TSC chair that I've been concerned about since when I got involved, even as the System Software Workgroup chair, was how do we present our documentation? How do we work on our documentation? And what does it look like? And so that is really the focus of today's, is giving you a feel for where it is, what is it, and then how does one begin developing in this world? Because with the OpenPOWER Foundation being committed to open source and open source activities, it only makes sense if you're going to do documentation that you have control over that documentation and do it in an open source fashion. So sometimes the documentation gets forgotten about as anything more than a PDF. Hopefully we'll show you that there's more to that than this story, and certainly then it's a way of recruiting people when they say, oh, we don't have the right documentation or we don't have good documentation. Give me a patch. Becomes the answer too for documentation. So I am Jeff Scheel, chair of the Technical Steering Committee, and we'll be talking about open source documentation and how do we do that inside of the foundation. Just out of curiosity, are you guys familiar with the resource catalog? If I describe, if I use that phrase, does that mean anything to you from an OpenPOWER Foundation perspective? I see one head going sideways, one going up and down. That's one more than I usually get. The answer to all documentation questions begins in the resource catalog off of the OpenPOWER Foundation website. And I'm going to stop here real quickly, just flip over and show you where that is on the OpenPOWER Foundation page and how you get there. So this is what it looks like today. The way you find the resource catalog is you go over to Technical, and in that menu, resource catalog is down there. Now, someday, hopefully, that'll simply be a list of documentation. I've clicked on the resource, I have a tab of the resource catalog, and I'll walk you through this. It's a little bit more difficult to find the documentation than we would like. This is a little more search engine. I would really like, in the long-range vision, to simply have a list of documents. You go down and say, that's the one I want. But the resource catalog is our mechanism for generally managing these things today. So let's go back here, go page down one. So the resource catalog link mentioned up there takes you to that page where, as I've sort of cut out, you have this ability to search all documents. The key document that we work with here out of the resource catalog is what we call the Documentation Development Guide. It is a document telling you how to develop documents inside of the foundation. And so to get there, you go to that search window that we had, you type in Documentation Development Guide, you get a list that gets dynamically built at the bottom for you. Think Hadoop search underneath the covers, you know, as you're typing in your information. You click on that, you get a landing page for the document that describes really what's going on in it. It categorizes it for you and gives you a link then essentially to the documentation environment, whatever document it is. In general, our Documentation Development Guide title page looks like the right-hand side there. Ironically, that's one of the things creating your own foundation requires you to do, is what is your documentation going to look like? And the heritage of this Documentation Development Guide is it is both how to develop documentation and the first document we did to decide how we wanted this stuff to look and behave. And so it is the starting point for all good things associated with doing documentation. So it turns out if you actually click on the link, I'll go back one more time. If you click on this link here that says, hey, here's the link to the guide, you don't get directly to the PDF to begin with. We generate documentation in two different forms, an HTML online form and the PDF as well. We tie those two together by basically sending you to the online document and then giving you a nice little Adobe Acrobat icon there that then takes you into the actual document. Now, that's the output. What most people don't understand is what's behind that. What's behind that is really DocBook. DocBook is an XML language, DTD specification, whatever you want to call it, for defining how to generate documentation. Looks very much like HTML, so that means it's tagged. Looks like HTML5, starting tag, ending tag with the backslash. We'll show you some of that. So it's XML based. All the source code for all of our documentation that is both HTML and PDF is available in Git repositories. Therefore, one can go in, do the typical geek thing, hacker thing. I'm grepping for a phrase. Look, it's in this file. That's wrong. Let's make the correction. Let's submit the patch, get it in, and it's done. So it gets treated like most code development projects. The way we do the builds and manage the builds is via Maven, open source tooling associated with generating HTML and PDFs and a variety of other things with, I can't think of the right, it's like XSL style sheets that sit on top of the build environment to style how you want the DocBook done, which basically says you're using all open source tooling to work on open source code to generate the output for what we are doing. So that's the overview. You see that, for example, out of Chapter 1 here in the Documentation Development Guide, you will get formatting that looks like this, whereby you can go next and previous, like one would expect to interact, and yet you also then end up with the equivalent sort of capability in a PDF form. Very nice way in a DocBook environment to control what your outputs are going to look like in either environments and keep it consistent, right? The real benefit is the more documents you have, the greater probability they're going to diverge in how they get styled if you're not using careful tooling, and you don't want that diverging, because in some sense this is your brand. This is how people perceive the documentation and perceive your foundation. So that's the overview. That's what the Documentation Development Guide sort of is an example of at this point. But let's dive a little bit deeper into how does this work. So if you go out to GitHub, to the OpenPOWER Foundation family or community, most of what I show you falls out of this docs template directory. But there really are two projects you need to care about for about 30 seconds before you get going, and that is, it turns out if you're going to provide a common look and feel and common front matter, end matter in a document, you probably need some master information lying around. And so when you get started the first time, you will need to replicate that look and feel, and then for the sake of all other environments, you can jump into your project. In this case, I'll show it to you out of Docs template and show you how that works. Both are great examples because they're also public repositories. They're out there. Anybody can go look at them. And so when you get the PDF, you can take a look, go see. And if you find something misspelled, go ahead, submit the patch to spell it correctly, and then I'll sit on it, do what a typical community maintainer would do. I'll sit on it, ignore it, and let you ping me about 5 times, and then maybe accept it. Well, we'll see. We'll see. We'll make trades, Chris. So then if one looks into sort of what's in GitHub, here's a couple pictures of it, right? It looks like any other GitHub with good license files and, of course, a good README. And we've tried to, for most of our OpenPOWER Foundation communities, give you clear sort of description of what we're doing, what licenses you're working under, how we want you to behave, what contributions process looks like, etc. And on this particular one, it's not been updated here. I've also built a video that describes how you go through and build the source as well. So largely what this talk is about, we've recorded a video, linked it off the website as to how does one actually work in this environment, and it includes all the details we're going to sort of step through here in the few remaining slides. So at the top level surface, it looks like really any other good open source project. How do we actually do a build? I mentioned there were 2 projects you needed to care about for any given build. The first is the master document, that common look and feel. You simply have to clone that in your working directory once as you get started. Then you clone whatever project you want to build. That's over here in the next one. In this case, we're using the documentation development guide, a very good way to get started. It's there, it's public. You can clone both, as this shows. You then go into the working directory where you want to do the build of the documentation. That's in our docs template, the template directory, and you kick off a Maven build, which is essentially Maven plus generate sources as your one command. As you redo things, there's another sort of parameter you intermittently will put on there, a clean, a Maven clean, kind of like a make clean before you actually make something. Maven has the same concept, so oftentimes if I'm iterating through things, I'll do a Maven clean generate sources, all in the same command line, clean it up, rebuild it, go take a look at what happens. And then the interesting question becomes, where do I go to get information? Maven builds everything in this environment into a target directory, sticks it always in a, independent of which projects, in the docbook/web help, and then however your project has been named in all the configuration files, you will go into that file, and I'll show you what that looks like. But essentially, cutting out some verbose messages, you can do all of that the first time, maybe 20 minutes. That sounds like, wow, that's a long time to build. For a document that's probably on the order of 20, 25 minutes. Second build is on the order of a minute or 2 off my laptop. So it's all open source code, builds, can build on your own, and that's how this world works. So that's how we build. Let me take you one more step deeper, and this is a little small, so I think I may flip over. I'll just give you a real summary. So, a real quick summary. When one gets into a project directory, the main book file, we try to always prefix with book_main. It then includes generally references or include type statements for each of the chapters. And it can be a hierarchy that continues. So, if we go to chapter 2 in the documentation development guide, the first chapter is all about how do I work in this environment. Chapter 2 is, can I give you a bunch of examples of things in DocBook that I might want to do so I can go in and look at the source and copy and tweak to get to where I really want my document to do. So chapter 2 is a whole bunch of documentation examples. That is in the chapter example.xml file. And you begin to see for the first time what source code looks like. We see for the, we have a chapter tag. If we go to the end of that file, you'd see the closing chapter tag. We have a title, documentation examples. Well, look what that, that matches what you're gonna title the document. We open up a section. Section has a title tag. Section title goes here. That's what it looks like on the output side. Going to start a paragraph. Here's an example of an itemized list. Let's see. Section covers something of interest, blah, 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 blah. Subsection again with the title, example itemized list. We start to see tags that start to look like things we'd expect. And if you've ever worked or looked at an HTML web page, some of these things start to look quite similar. It might be OL in HTML, it's ordered list in DocBook. So you will start to see those sorts of examples. So let's go in and just blow it up a little bit here and show you a few things in a little more detail. Okay. So here again is the main landing page for these documents. This, when you click on the link to the document, brings you in. If we go, come back. If we go to chapter 1.1 here, where we were looking, we were in chapter 2 with the documentation examples. We see that we also have, and these look a little odd because they really don't have much content on the HTML side, but you start to see how you can get the HTML equivalent of what we had in the PDF side over here, documentation examples. It's just chunked into small web pages. So here are the examples. If we come back to the source code, then here is that same source code. So just as I said, the chapter tags at the top. If we jump to the bottom of this, we see that there's an ending chapter tag. And this document then contains all of these tags help the Maven and the Apache faux project generate the right output here. So the sorts of examples we give you: itemized list, ordered list, a variable list. How do I embed a graphic? How do I build a table? How do I do special things like merging cells in a table horizontally? How do I do that vertically? How do I do cross-references and footnotes, citations? I mean, it just gets more and more specialized in things we want to do. Again, the nice thing about that is, if you have the example document and say, oh wow, I want to embed a graphic, I don't know how to do that. You have the documentation development guide here. You also have the source. What was the title of the graphic is example figure. Let's go into the source here in this chapter file, and let's look for example figure. So we see here at the beginning, it says here's how you embed a graphic. Let's just make sure it's the right thing. Here's how you embed the graphic. So we see we have our paragraph tag. We end the paragraph. We start into our figure. And these are the sorts of objects we need to fill in to do a figure. Of course, it has a title, has a couple other things that ultimately resolve down to where is the item we want to include and how do we want to format it. And the rest of it is just tags around it to make sure it's going to appear the right way. So again, the documentation development guide shows you how to do common things and a little more complex things. And this is all generating what we would consider probably pretty good looking output in both HTML and PDF form. So that's how you build. That's what you get. That's where you get help, is the documentation development guide. And then the question becomes, so what else is out there? What else are we building this way? Well, other examples that come out of particular work groups I'm familiar with, like the System Software Work Group, is the ELF-ABI documentation now is all owned by the foundation and managed in this fashion. The Accelerator Work Group has several documents. Anybody familiar with PAPR? The big monster IBM document for how do you describe the interfaces? We have a Linux subset of PAPR that we've contributed to the OpenPOWER Foundation, and we're on the verge of contributing in pieces to do this that's up to date. And so we've been taking control of all the documents we get contributed to the foundation and getting them into the form. Not always easy when documentation comes out of IBM. Get them into a form where, just like I've shown you, it's docbook tags, generates HTML and PDF out, managed through GitHub, built with Maven, to give the foundation key look and feel associated with the documentation around it. Just several examples. So that's what we've been up to. If you want to contribute to any of the projects, you can certainly start by working on the public ones that are out in the OpenPOWER Foundation. The ELF-ABI, it says it's private there. It has now been approved. It is public. You can go see the source code for the ELF-ABI. It tells you right up front in the abstract area, there's a mailing list behind it. If you want to make changes, you want to propose things, send it to that mailing list. Start interacting with the folks behind it. They're always looking for cleanup, etc., cleanup ideas, questions that come out of this section's a little ambiguous relative to something. So that's how you can find the public stuff. You don't need my help to get involved in the public activities, but there is a whole set of private activities, especially for the closed work groups, where there aren't public work groups, they're foundation-only work groups. A lot of those communities, like I was saying, the accelerator work group's one of those. They have documentation. Same environment, just not public trees. You know, so the goal here is to be very collaborative, treat documentation as source code, allow developers to basically contribute to this. And in the broader vision, the final question that might come out of people that have worked like with the OpenPOWER, Opal, Ski Boot, those sorts of people. If you've looked at any of their documentation, it is all, what's the project it's built out of? It's not RST. It's one of the, the new markdown languages, a lot simpler language. They have their own format, and we've wanted them to create documentation as they go. I'm working on a way to take their output, their build tools, format it to get it into a docbook format, and just basically extend their process so we can make it have this look and feel in docbook, but allow them to maintain it in their markdown language. I can't remember which one it is again, my apologies. But that's ultimately the goal as well. So you'd get ski boot documentation that looked like it came through the foundation. But I didn't want to, I didn't want that community to change how they were doing things. I didn't want to complicate their life, and I certainly don't want to maintain two different templates of look and feel, try to keep them together. Do it the way you're doing it, Stuart and Jeremy and everybody. We'll figure out how to put it in a better format later. I'll take that responsibility. So that's where we're headed is one of the things. I have a patch of how to do that. It needed to age because the first round of anything like that, you discover the assumptions you made were either good or bad. And I let the first round age about 6 months and discovered how bad the idea was, so I had to throw it away and find a different route. So I'm getting ready to go back, make sure it still works the way they're developing their documentation. So that's what we're up to. Again, last reminder, if you want to get involved, the documentation development guide is it. We walk you through several different scenarios. How do I get tools on there? How do I understand the project structure? How do I create a new document from scratch? Net, go copy a template, start hacking on it. How do I create, we've added a new section in there, how do I start working on an existing document? How do I debug build failures? Maven is very esoteric in its build failure. I mean, it makes GCC look like a verbose and concise compiler. You can have really odd failures in this Maven Apache Foe environment. And so as we've had common themed errors, we'll post text that says, all right, if you get an error like this, look here, do this sort of thing to help you walk through errors. We walk through the process of how to publish them in the OpenPOWER documentation world. And then, of course, as we mentioned, Section 2 is all about all these examples. I need an ordered list. Oh, I need an unordered list. Oh, I want an S list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is where the guide is. And so we're trying to use open tools. We're trying to do documentation just like code, but at the same time, make sure we maintain a brand, a good look and feel, a good clean look and feel, and we're always looking for help.